This is America, and this is the Friendship Archway in the nation's capital. It's a 40-year-old landmark that was designed to cement the friendship between Washington, D.C. and Beijing. That relationship, though, has become just a little fraught of late. Donald Trump now heading to China to try and smooth things over and talk about issues like the Iran war and Taiwan. I'll be looking at one of those flashpoints in just a few minutes. But first, let's head to our studio here in D.C. and Cyril Vanier.
Richard Gaisford, thank you very much. There's only one country in the world that comes close to competing with the United States, and that's China. Economically, diplomatically, and maybe soon militarily. So as the U.S. president embarks on a two-day official visit to Beijing, we embark on a two-part show. Today, Iran and Taiwan, not direct confrontations between the U.S. and China, rather flashpoints where they flex their hard power to bend events and people to their will. The war that is and the war that could be. Donald Trump needs China's help with the former and wants to avoid the latter.
China.
I have a great relationship with President Xi, but we have developed a friendship. I can see that. And I think long term, I have a great relationship with President Xi. And I think you can see that with the fact that in Hormuz, they get a big percentage, 40% of their oil from Hormuz. Taiwan, I mean, he'll bring up Taiwan, I think, more than I will.
Al Jazeera's Mike Hanna is at the White House for us. Mike, if we leave aside trade issues, which we'll deal with in tomorrow's show, what does Donald Trump want out of this trip and the relationship with China?
Well, he's being accompanied by a number of very prominent business leaders, so it does appear that some of these discussions will be very specific to American business. He also wants access to China's rare earth. This is something that he's been looking for, very important for the U.S. computer industry and chip industry. And then, of course, he'll be seeking a greater technological partnership with China. And he did confirm shortly before leaving the White House that Iran will also be on the agenda.
Well, I think, number one, we're going to have a long talk about it. I think he's been relatively good, to be honest with you. You look at the blockade, no problem. It's going to be a positive. We're going to have a very good meeting. I spoke with President Xi. We both look forward to the meeting. It's going to be great.
But above all, President Trump really needs a win. He wants to demonstrate that he's a statesman, a diplomat at the top of his game. And in the end, it's not necessarily what is achieved, but how it looks.
Al Jazeera's Mike Hanna reporting from the White House there. Thank you very much, Mike. And when the meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping was first scheduled, tariffs and trade were expected to be the biggest item on the agenda. Then came the Iran war, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and a global energy shock. China is feeling that fallout. The oil it used to import from Iran, about 13% of its import needs, is stuck in the Gulf. All of this because of an American war. Richard Gaisford reports.
Donald Trump spent most of the conflict saying the Strait of Hormuz isn't his problem.
Maybe we shouldn't even be there at all because we don't need it. We have a lot of oil. We're the #1 producer anywhere in the world times two. By double, at least double. Now I think it's much higher than that.
But the Chinese know that's not the case, expecting the US president to look for their help in putting pressure on Iran to get the vital shipping lane unblocked. China certainly has a vested interest and close links to the Iranian government. China's the world's largest importer of oil. The Chinese have ignored US sanctions and buy 90% of Iran's output. In the last year, that accounted for 13.6% of all the crude oil imported into China, equating to 1.38 million barrels a day. Up to half of Chinese total oil imports come via the Strait of Hormuz. The Middle East's also a growing market for Chinese products, with exports affected by the continued standoff.
China is an export-driven economy. That means they depend on other countries to buy from them. Well, you can't buy from them if you can't ship it there, and you can't buy from them if your economy is being destroyed by what Iran is doing. So it is in China's interest that Iran stop closing the straits. It's harming China as well.
But despite self-interest, China's largely sat on the sidelines when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz. Donald Trump needs it to be open to be able to claim victory. But what price will he have to pay China to help make that happen? Trump's tariffs on Chinese goods could be one point of discussion, as might access to US markets for Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers. Well, it's widely thought the closure of the Strait of Hormuz was an unintended consequence of the war for Donald Trump. Another one might be having to soften his position on China just to get it reopened again. Richard Gaisford, Al Jazeera, Washington, D.C.
And we're joined now by Dan Grazier, Senior Fellow and Director of the National Security Reform Program at the Stimson Center. And we're joined by Gregory Poling, Director and Senior Fellow at the Southeast Asia Program and Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. So really big picture question with you, Gregory, if you'll allow me to start. Very big picture. Is Donald Trump in a position of strength as he sets off for China?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the lesson that Beijing took away from the tit-for-tat responses to the trade war last year, and especially the U.S. climb down after China restricted rare earth exports, was that Beijing has far more leverage than maybe it even anticipated, and that it doesn't actually need to make major concessions, not major structural concessions to the U.S. anyway.
Now, Donald Trump did tweet, this was last month in April, or rather he wrote on his Truth Social media, that Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, would give him, and you may have read this quote, a, quote, big fat hug for having reopened the Strait of Hormuz. But this was more than a month ago. The U.S. hasn't reopened the Strait of Hormuz. So no big fat hug then.
Well, I guess it remains to be seen. We'll have to watch for the initial greeting. The Strait of Hormuz is certainly an important waterway, as part of just global trade goes. I think the importance of it with relation to China has been a little bit overblown. So the Chinese certainly buy a lot of oil. They buy about 90% of Iran's oil, but that's still only about 10% or so of the oil that China uses. And plus, China has worked very hard over the last couple of years to make themselves as anti-fragile as possible with regards to their sources of energy. And so they've really diversified their sources of oil. So again, Iran's important, but it's not critical.
Yeah, all jokes aside then, big fat hug aside, how is China looking at this? Because Donald Trump did just create a problem that didn't previously exist for China.
Well, I think that China has a bigger concern here, which is if the Strait of Hormuz can be tolled, can be closed, then so can pretty much any other waterway on Earth. And as a nation that both depends on global trade and that views itself as a rule maker in the 21st century, this whole idea that we're just going to let well-settled pieces of international law go because we made a mistake, that's not something that I think Beijing is prepared to live with. And Beijing's been very clear in its own messaging to Iran that it wants to see the strait open, aside from how much that might actually affect China's national energy security.
What does Donald Trump want from China? Because all the reporting is he would like China's help, right, in leaning on Iran, not only bring Iran to the table for negotiations, but also reopen the Strait of Hormuz.
I have no doubt that Donald Trump is going to at least try to enlist Xi Jinping to assert some pressure, maybe some like gentle nudges for the Iranians to come back to the table and agree to a settlement. Because frankly, sometimes that's the only way that that these kind of agreements can be made is by working through others. But
how does that work? There has to be, one assumes, some give and take, right? If China is going to help him out on Iran, to the extent that they can, they would be asking for something in return, right, from Donald Trump?
Presumably. I think maybe Iran is the one issue where increasingly their interests overlap. Both sides would like to see Iran compromise. Both sides would like to see the strait opened.
So he may not have to push very hard.
Well, but the question is, does China want that as much as the U.S.? And I think clearly the answer is no. China would like it, but it is not China being humiliated in the Strait of Hormuz, it's the U.S.
We're looking at the rivalry between these two peer competitors in the world, the U.S. and China. What do you think China took away from the last 2 months? It's been watching the U.S. go to war, another American war. What has it learned?
Well, I know the Chinese military and Chinese leadership has to be watching how the United States actually operates in 2026 in a military sense. They're trying to learn as many lessons as they possibly can because clearly the United States is their closest peer competitor. And so they're going to be looking for lessons learned just as much as American military planners are. But beyond that, I'm sure the Chinese are probably very happy that the United States is distracted again in the Middle East and not focused, on China so much.
There's a saying, don't interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. And that's been said about this conflict and the way China might be assessing the U.S. action in the Middle East and against Iran. Do you think that's fair? Do you think China is looking at this as a mistake, something that weakens the U.S. relative to them?
I think this reinforces what Xi Jinping probably already thought, which was, as he often says, that it's China's time now, that the U.S. is a failing power. Now, that said, I think China has somewhat limited ability to take advantage of this because China is also wildly popular in most of the world, global north and global south, and has been getting more and more unpopular. So it's much more, I think, at this point, a pox on both your houses from countries who are not the U.S. or China.
All right, we've looked at the Strait of Hormuz and China's position on Iran. You've said that U.S. and Chinese interests on this narrow issue might actually converge because they would both benefit from the Strait of Hormuz being reopened. China would get its oil. U.S. would obviously benefit. Let's look at Taiwan, the other major flashpoint. Al Jazeera's Alex Baird explains why Taiwan is such a dangerous flashpoint between the U.S. and China specifically.
Taiwan, the greatest risk for China-US relations. That was the Chinese foreign minister just last week. But why? Well, let's take a look back to understand how we got here. This all begins with the Chinese Civil War nearly 8 decades ago. After years of fighting, the Communist Party seized control of the mainland, forcing the defeated nationalist government to retreat to Taiwan and rule from there. No peace treaty was ever signed, and Beijing has claimed the island as its territory ever since. The government in Taiwan continued to hold China's United Nations seat until 1971, when that was officially transferred to Beijing. For the United States, formal recognition of Beijing officially began in 1979.
The United States recognizes the government of the People's Republic of China as a sole legal government of China.
Before that, it officially recognized the government in Taiwan as the legitimate government of all China. But just after that 79 switch, the US Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act. That allowed for continued unofficial relations, arms sales, and a commitment to help Taiwan maintain its self-defense. Since then, US policy has been ambiguous. No official support for the island's independence, but also treating it as distinct from the mainland. Washington has also refused to state whether or not it would intervene militarily if China attacked Taiwan, something Beijing hasn't ruled out. Those recent military drills around the island have been powerful reminders of that, because for Beijing, Taiwan is an unalienable part of its territory. But US support for the territory has continued to be active. Washington has made more than $50 billion worth of military sales to date, and there's another $14 billion package waiting on President Trump's desk for approval. But he's said that he'd discuss that package with China's President Xi, and that's raising concern in Taipei that US policy could be changing. And then there's trade. The Trump administration has finalized a deal with Taiwan that will funnel up to $500 billion worth of investment into the US semiconductor and AI industries. But on the other side, US goods trade with China was worth at least $400 billion last year. No matter how you look at it, US-China relations are a delicate dance with not just billions of dollars at stake, but also global peace and security.
Gregory Poling, the big question, how likely is a war in the future between the U.S. and China over Taiwan?
The future is a long time. I don't think it's particularly likely in the next couple of years. I don't think there's a lot of good evidence that Beijing is really prepared in any imminent sense, especially after Xi Jinping has basically wiped out all of his senior military leadership. And I think that the lessons, both in the Strait of Hormuz and earlier from Ukraine attacking the Russian Black Sea Fleet, have to give China a lot of pause about whether it would actually be able to invade the island if it ever wanted to.
Dan Grazier, I believe you've written you don't think that China wants to invade Taiwan. Am I right?
That is absolutely correct. Yes, two of my colleagues and I, we wrote a big report last year about this because we looked into it like very, very strongly. Now, I take the Chinese leaders at their word that they want to gain full political control over Taiwan. I believe them when they say that. but I don't believe they're going to use military means to accomplish it. If China does regain full political control over Taiwan, they're going to do it in a manner that looks much more like the way they gained control over Hong Kong.
Okay, yeah, you took the words out of my mouth. Not a kinetic, not a military blueprint, more of a gradual encroachment on the rights and gaining influence.
Right. They're going to use every other element of national power other than their military power to accomplish their goal. An amphibious invasion of Taiwan would be the largest, most complex single military operation in history. And Taiwan is not particularly well suited geographically for such an operation. You know, a lot of people in Washington focus on the challenge of just crossing the strait, but the Chinese have to think about how they would actually conquer Taiwan. It's an incredibly complex, just geographic, spot on the map. It has, it has the tallest mountains in East Asia, and it has a population of 24 million people that has to exist on the, 40% of the island that isn't covered by mountains. And the only way that you do that is by concentrating the population in very big cities like Taipei, Kaohsiung, or Taichung. And then you also have to feed the population, which means that every spot of flat ground that isn't covered by a city is covered by a rice paddy. And guess what cannot cross a rice paddy? A tank. So it would be an incredibly difficult military operation to conquer Taiwan, which again is why I believe that the Chinese are going to use every means other than military to accomplish their goals.
So how much of a flashpoint is it really then? We use that word. It's often the word that's used to describe Taiwan, meaning that it's just a fulcrum for these tensions between the U.S. and China, with a chance that it could spark some measure of confrontation between these two countries. How fair is that, and what's the level of risk then?
I mean, I think it is a not insignificant risk. Aside from the amphibious landing, we do have a lot of other things going on. We have constant Chinese pressure on Taiwan's outlying islands like Kinmen and Matsu. We have aggressive, what people call gray zone coercion, unsafe interactions with Taiwanese Coast Guard and Navy and air operations. So there's lots of space for an accident. An accident.
An accident between who?
Between China and Taiwan that could escalate very quickly, and put the U.S. in a position of needing to decide whether and how to respond. So I think perhaps we spend too much time thinking about the amphibious landing part and not enough time looking at all the other areas where you could get into a military escalation short of stopping a Chinese amphibious landing across the strait.
So we looked at the U.S.'s National Defense Strategy, the 2025 document that was published by the Trump administration. And page 23, it says, quote, deterring a conflict over Taiwan, ideally by preserving our military overmatch, is a priority. So priority for the U.S. to maintain U.S. military dominance in that part of the world. Can the U.S. do that going forward?
It remains to be seen. It would take a massive investment to be able to kind of maintain that. But then again, to your point, that creates the potential flashpoint. I think if there is a conflict over Taiwan, we're going to blunder into it. It's not going to be a deliberate choice. And so the danger of a big military buildup, and by maintaining that overmatch in the region, that actually increases the number of potential flashpoints where, if we have U.S. military equipment operating in close proximity to Chinese military equipment, there's always the chance that somebody's going to, bump into each other, or, we'll have an incident like it happened in the summer of 2001, where a Chinese fighter plane crashed into a U.S. spy plane and caused an international incident. Those are the kind of things that I worry about. And the more that the United States pursues a strategy of maintaining a military overmatch in the region, the higher the chance we're going to have more incidences like that.
So that brings me to one of the main questions that really we want to address today, which is the military competition between the U.S. and China. And I'm interested in how both of you think about this. A few numbers first. How do the U.S. and China compare in terms of military power? It is hard to get, bear this in mind, hard to get reliable numbers for the Chinese military. But here's what we have. The U.S. spends more money on its military, a lot more. Recently, the U.S. defense budget has been about $886 billion. So that is by far the #1 defense budget globally. and it is 3 to 4 times China's defense, which officially stands at $225 billion, with a caveat that that number is widely believed to be underreported. Now, troop numbers, the U.S. actually has a smaller military. It has 1.3 million active military personnel, while China has the world's largest standing military by head count, with 2 million troops. Now, look at some of the hardware. The U.S. has 13,000 aircraft, including the only operational 5th-generation stealth fleet at scale. And China, by comparison, has 3,300 total aircraft that we know of. And their production of J-20 stealth fighters is closing the gap. That's true. But the true number of those is unknown. Is that, Gregory Poling, we gave like the basic metrics, right? Troop numbers, number of planes. We should have included ships. That's important too. But is that metric what you look at?
It's part of it. It's part of a very complicated equation. One, the U.S. military has global responsibilities. China's doesn't. So China's military is concentrated almost entirely in China's near waters, as China calls it, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and the Taiwan Strait. The other side of that, the U.S. has a network of allies, both around the world and in Asia. Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Australia. China's closest thing to an ally is North Korea. So I think how you look at the problem determines whether or not you think that the U.S. is still capable of holding to deterrence. But the one thing that is clear is that the U.S. cannot build ships as fast or as cheaply as China. And U.S. soldiers cannot work for as little as Chinese soldiers. So we are never going to maintain overmatch if what you're worried about is meeting China ship for ship and troop for troop. You need to focus more on asymmetric capabilities in partnership with the network of U.S. allies.
Dan Grazier, what's the question I should be asking then? Because for a layman, you kind of look at, well, if they were involved, the U.S. and China, in a head-to-head conflict, who would win? Or at least who would have the greater chance of winning? But maybe that's not even the best question to be asking.
That is a difficult question, actually. I think that if, God forbid, the United States and China does blunder into a war, I don't think either side in that conflict would actually win. It would probably be somebody else other than the two belligerents. Just because the United States and China are both nuclear powers. And if we get into a direct military confrontation, the chances of an escalation skyrocket, and it's unthinkable to imagine what would happen. So I think the question shouldn't be who would win in such a conflict. It's what can we do to prevent that kind of a conflict, because it would be a disaster for both sides.
Well, let me put the question this way then, Gregory Poling. Is there a point where you think the U.S. might no longer be the world's military superpower? And if so, what would that change?
I honestly don't know, because I think we get to a point where it's impossible to know for sure how effective the capabilities are of either side unless you cross the line that neither ever wants to cross, right? At some point, you're just moving things around on a spreadsheet, I worry. What I do know is that the U.S. is a military superpower, and China, if not already, is on the cusp of being a military superpower. And that puts those two parties in a league of their own.
You mentioned the global reach of the U.S. military. So a couple data points on that. The global reach of the American versus Chinese military. Now, the U.S. has troops stationed in at least 80 countries, which, by the way, is about half the countries in the world. They also have, as Gregory mentioned, strong military alliances, NATO in Europe, as well as alliances in the Indo-Pacific, for instance, Japan, South Korea, but there are others. China, on the other hand, only has one overseas base in Djibouti, Horn of Africa. They're also reportedly expanding their presence at the Ream naval base in Cambodia. And China also has stakes in port projects globally. That's interesting. China owns 93 ports in 53 countries outright. Many of those have significant military potential, even if they're commercial ports. So the Chinese Navy, the PLA, officially called in to 1/3 of those. About 30 ports have made use of their dual-use potential. Plus, 53 of the ports that China either owns or has majority stakes in are near key maritime choke points. We come back to that, like the Malacca Strait, Strait of Hormuz, or the Suez Canal. Dan Grazier, this is the one really, I would argue, most distinctive feature of the U.S. military is the ability to project around the world. We just saw it with Iran. It means that within weeks, they're already pre-positioned from an infrastructure, military infrastructure standpoint, that they can ramp up a military effort and launch a war pretty much anywhere.
Yes, and that's something that the U.S. military prides itself on. when I was in the Marine Corps, we talked about our rapid deployment capability all the time. That's just it's kind of a hallmark. Of the Marine Corps, certain elements of the Army, the Navy and the Air Force have a global reach because that's how the U.S. military has been designed. And the United States has had that responsibility since the end of World War II to provide a lot of security around the world. But that doesn't mean that we necessarily need to be going and picking fights all over the world, because there's always the law of unintended consequences, and we've seen over the last 25 years how it's really easy to get into these kind of conflicts, but it's really difficult to get out of them. And so a lot of times the best move is not to play.
Gentlemen, that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank you both for joining us in the studio. That's Dan Grazier, Senior Fellow and Director of the National Security Reform Program at the Stimson Center, and Gregory Poling, Director and Senior Fellow at the Southeast Asia Program and Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at the CSIS. Thank you very much to both of you. And that's it from the team here in Washington, and part one of our look at U.S.-China relations focused on military flashpoints. For now, back to Richard Gaisford and our global headquarters in Doha.
Thanks, Cyril. On the next edition of This is America, we'll be looking at how Donald Trump needs to move past diplomatic platitudes to reinforce a fragile trade truce with China. That's Wednesday, 18:30 GMT, 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time here in the United States. For now, though, from Washington's Chinatown, it's goodbye.